Texas Crossroads of North America by Jesús F. de la Teja, Ron Tyler, Nancy Beck, Chapter 4, New Neighbors, New Challenges, 1800 to 1821. Benito de Armanian, interim governor of Texas in the spring of 1814, had an impossible task to perform in the aftermath of the royalist victory over the latest rebellion in the province. Families had been broken up by the death or flight of husbands, fathers, and sons. Crops had been destroyed or consumed by the contending forces, and the little commerce the province enjoyed had been subjected to disruption by Indian attack. The third and depressed Armenian sat down to write his superior commandment general Joaquin Arredondo to explain why he might have to resort to violence to keep his men fed if higher authorities did not see fit to send relief immediately. They are hopelessly lost in their last misery. They have been weakened by their past misfortunes. They are complaining most piteously over the lack of sustenance for themselves and their families. They are lamenting over the crisis and weeping bitterly over their fate, especially when they remember the terrible misery which lies before them. Relief did not come for Armanian, and it did not come for his successors. What did come from were American and European adventurers, pirates, and Indian raiders who made life as precarious for Texas Spanish settlements as it had been at the height of the Indian Wars of the 1770s and 1780s. The news that Spain and the United States had agreed on border that respected Spanish claims to Texas was of little consolation to frontier officials or the surviving Tejano population. A decade of destruction and terror had left them so hopelessly lost in their misery that they greeted Mexican independence with no great jubilation. Rather, they began to heal the wounds that had divided families. They began to think about hoping again. The first 2 decades of the 19th century were marked by a level of violence and destruction in Texas that came close to extinguishing the Hispanic presence there. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte forced Spain to cede to Louisiana as part of his plan to resurrect a French empire in North America. When the plan fell through, he sold the territory to the United States in 1803. While Spain and the United States almost came to blows over U.S. claims to everything east of the Rio Grande, as part of the Louisiana Purchase, the outbreak of the Mexican War of Independence led to insurrection in Texas on numerous occasions, including the overthrow of Texas Spanish governor twice. The bloodiest battle ever fought on Texas soil occurred in 1813 and led to the death or flight of over 1,000 Tejanos, leaving Nacogdoches virtually abandoned and San Antonio in ruins. The arrival of pirates and adventurers added to the tense conditions in Spanish Texas. For the Indian peoples of the region, the opening decades of the decade were also a great time of great changes, creating opportunities for some and spelling the demise of others. For the Norentenos and the Comanches in particular, the inability of Spanish officials to maintain the supply of gifts required by the treaties of the 1780s meant a resumption of raiding. Other indigenous groups that suffered in continuing rounds of epidemics and intertribal warfare disappeared from much of East Texas, leaving the way open for migrant Indian groups from east of the Mississippi, which hoped to find safe haven from American settlers in Spanish Texas. These new arrivals, like the remaining indigenous tribes, paid scant attention to the international borders that both the Spanish crown and the U.S. government contested. Texas governors, after Arminian, faced the same insurmountable problems as did Spanish officials along the Rio Grande, in Nuevo Santander and New Mexico. The last years of Spain's presence in the region were marked by a desperate bid for survival that failed. The remaining Tejanos whose homeland was Texas hunkered down to outlast the evil times as their ancestors had in the previous century. Only the Comanches seemed to thrive in the endemically violent circumstances as Spanish Texas emerged the poorest and most sparsely settled portion of the New Mexico nation. As you read this chapter, consider the following questions. What made Louisiana Purchase critical event in Texas history? What conditions in Mexico contributed to the outbreak of a war for independence, and what circumstances contributed to Texas taking part in this struggle? How did the conditions in the last years of Spanish Texas contribute to the idea of the region as howling wilderness? Here is the time chart. Louisiana, once again, a contested frontier. In 1800, no one in Texas or Mexico City or even Madrid could have foreseen the chain of events that left the Spanish Empire in ruins, and Texas, nominally a part of independent Mexico for more than a decade, New Spain had fought against U.S. expansionism along the Mississippi River and its eastern tributaries. Although the situation was precarious, it was not out of control. Spanish officials recognized U.S. expansionism as a dangerous successor to British imperialism and moved to counter the threat with the meager resources at their disposal. Beginning in the 1780s, local officials took matters into their own hands and allowed Protestant families to settle in Louisiana. In time, they were joined by other Anglo-Americans interested in the economic opportunities available in Spanish Missouri, Natchez, and Louisiana. Spanish officials in Florida and Louisiana also took advantage of Indian dissatisfaction with Anglo-American pioneers to keep the United States at bay. A number of southeastern tribes took refuge on the Spanish side of the border or conducted raids against intruding Anglo-American settlers with the support of local Spanish authorities. Slavery was legal in the Spanish world, but slaves from U.S. territory were granted their freedom in Spanish Florida and Louisiana, an issue that became a particular sore point in Spanish-U.S. relations. After Spain was drawn into the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, it proved impossible to maintain adequate commercial contacts with its American empire or to properly defend it against outside threats. As tension over trade, Indian relations, and slave flight mounted, Madrid forestalled a direct confrontation with Washington by entering into the Treaty of San Lorenzo in 1795. By the terms of the treaty, U.S. citizens enjoyed navigation rights on the Mississippi River and the right to use New Orleans as a transshipment port for their products. In addition, both countries would restrain the Indians on their side of the border from conducting depredations on the other side. Numerous Anglo-American and European entrepreneurs saw great opportunities in Spain's desperate effort to reinforce Louisiana and Texas in the face of U.S. expansion. Some had big schemes, like Pennsylvania Dutch innkeeper Pedro Palos, who offered to settle 3,000 families on condition that they have freedom of worship, local government, and generous land allotment. His plan never amounted to anything. Some had more modest ambitions, like William Barr, another Irish immigrant who became a Spanish subject in Louisiana before moving to Nacogdoches in 1793. Barr established himself as an Indian trader and entered into partnership with Nacogdoches merchant Peter Samuel Davenport. The House of Barr and Davenport gained monopoly on Indian trade in northern Texas. Barr died a wealthy man in 1810. By the last decade of the 18th century, then Texas was becoming a destination for foreign adventurers and businessmen who would leave their stamp on the state's history. Adventurer Philip Nolan, horse trader or spy. It was in these circumstances that the adventurers like Philip Nolan and the self-styled Baron of Bostrom made their way to Louisiana-Texas frontier. The two men could not have been more different, as a young man, Philip Nolan, had immigrated from Ireland to the western frontier of the new United States, where he became a protege of General James Wilkinson, the American military man who maintained very friendly relations with the Spaniards. At one point in his career, he was actually employed by the Spanish crown. Soon had Nolan acting as his business agent in New Orleans. While in the Louisiana capital, the 20-year-old Irish-American learned about the Indian trade opportunities in Texas, which led in 1791 to the first of a number of trips there for him. Officially, commercial contacts between Texas and Louisiana were forbidden under Spain's tightly regulated mercantile system. Despite a series of reforms intended to expand trading opportunities among its various American colonies, Spain's mercantilist policies remained the most restrictive of the European empires on paper. In reality, an inefficient and corrupt customs and administrative system meant that contraband, graft, and incompetence were rife. At the time of the American Revolution, the Spanish crown had consented to a limited livestock trade between Texas and Louisiana, and it was this authorization that adventurers like Nolan took advantage of in order to trade with Texas Indians. The governor of Spanish Louisiana did not think twice about giving Nolan a passport to gather livestock in Texas. To Texas authorities, Nolan's trading license was not valid. They suspected the Irish-American tradesman of being a spy, a bandist, or both, and officials of the Nacogdoches confiscated his merchandise. Financially ruined and in no hurry to return to Louisiana, Nolan chose to spend some time living with various Texas Indian tribes, among them the Comanches. Although Nolan claimed that the independence of the savage life was always congenial to my nature, he also admitted that he could not completely Indianify. Between 1794 and 1799, Nolan made two more successful trading expeditions to Texas. It was not just the province's Indian who welcomed the opportunity to trade for the higher quality manufactured goods that Nolan's company brought with him. Tejanos also did business illegally with the American, and not just business, as Nolan fathered a son in San Antonio during one of his visits. He eventually sold the horses, hides, and furs he collected in Texas as far east as Frankfort, Kentucky, attracting even more interest among American frontiermen and the Texas trade. Nolan had caught Texas fever, but he had also caught the attention of Spanish authority. Their suspicions were confirmed when he returned to Texas in the fall of 1800, leading a large body of men despite the Louisiana governor having denied him a new license. A deserter from the expedition, Moredici Richards, later declared that Nolan had maps of all the rivers, marked all the distances, and explored everything more attentively than a man would do who had no other ends in view than that of catching horses. That he had told him many times that there were mines in this country, and moreover that he had assured his men that if the Spaniards killed a single one of them, he would take a commission as an English general and would take possessions of all this country, unquote. It was not one of his men, but Nolan himself, who died at the hands of the Spaniards. He built corrals and began catching horses and trading with Wichita and Comanche bands in what is now hill country. But a Spanish patrol caught up with him in March of 1801 after Nolan was killed by a cannonball. His men quickly surrendered, claiming that their only goal had been to capture mustangs. Authorities remained unconvinced, however. Businessman, the Baron of Bostrom, would be a colonizer. Another adventurer who eventually turned to Texas for new opportunities was the Baron of Bostrom. A native of Dutch Guiana, Philip Hendrik Bogle had moved to Holland as a child and had become a tax collector accused of embezzlement in 1793. He fled the country, adopting the title by which he would henceforth be known. After arriving in Louisiana in 1795, he undertook a variety of business ventures, including real estate development, with only minor success. Bastrom's land schemes began shortly after his arrival in Louisiana, when he received permission from the governor to settle families along the Ouachita River. During a recruiting trip to the United States in 1797, a new governor arrived in Louisiana who opposed settlement by Protestant Anglo-Americans and suspended Bastrom's projects, seeing his land schemes evaporate. Bostrom turned to Indian trade as a means of recovering his fortunes. Although he obtained a contract to supply the Indians along Ouachita River with the merchandise, the sale of the Louisiana to the United States in 1803 brought an end to his monopoly and to his profits. Bostrom, like a number of other Louisiana land promoters, now turned his attention to Texas, bearing a letter of recommendation from his friends. The former governor of Louisiana, in the fall of 1805, he arrived in San Antonio, where he proposed to establish a colony between Bexar and Trinity River. The settlers would be some of the families he had previously brought to Louisiana, along with friendly and agricultural Choctaws. Having learned his lesson from the Ouachita Project, he pledged to introduce only Catholic families. Both Texas Governor Antonio Cordero and Commandant General Nemesio Salcedo thought the project worth pursuing, as it fit with their plans to expand settlement in Texas to counter U.S. occupation of Louisiana. Immediately after the territory's transfer to the United States, President Thomas Jefferson, basing his position on French documents, had claimed that all the lands as far as the Rio Grande were included in the purchase. Spanish colonial authorities, facing what the Baron called the daring land hunger of the infamous class of Americans, along with Jefferson's claims, naturally grasped at the colonization proposals of Bostrom and other Louisianans in order to create the first line of defense in Texas. Although Bastrom's initial project fell through, the Baron soon settled in San Antonio, where he became a leading member of the community. This will be the end of Chapter 4, Part 1.